So the government comes out with CPI this week, right? And everyone is expecting that inflation has moderated. There's a 95% probability that we're going to have a rate cut coming up next month. And so what happens? CPI comes in at 2.9%, and core CPI, where you take out food and energy, for those people that don't eat or heat their house or use electricity, comes out at 3.1%. Okay? So basically that tells us that, at least by the trailing data, inflation is not moderating. Okay? Now couple that with the fact that last week the government revised their employment numbers, and basically there were 911,000 jobs that they reported that basically did not happen. Okay, and remember, in 2024, when they revised the numbers, it was over 800,000 jobs. Okay, so what you have happening in the economy is basically employment weakening, but inflation is staying persistent. Okay, and there's been so much political pressure put on the Fed that these bozos are going to cut interest rates again, like they did before the election for no reason. And they're going to cut interest rates when clearly the only thing that's happening is labor is weakening a little bit, but the economy is still strong. Earnings are still strong among the public companies. And it just appears that consumers, particularly the ones at the lower end of the spectrum, are being challenged with the continuing of inflation rearing its ugly head. And I think anybody, whether you're affluent, rich, or moderate income or poor, everyone knows that inflation is still a big factor in everybody's life. And I can just tell you anecdotally, okay, I have a house here. Admittedly, it's a fairly big house, but it's, 5 bedrooms, 4 baths. So it's a pretty big house. But my utility bill last month was $850. Okay? Now, going back, say pre-COVID, my utility bill was like $300 in the summer when I'm running the air conditioning and running the pool. Okay, so I went from $350, then it was $550, now it's $850. Okay? That is insane inflation. Not to mention that, my food bills have doubled, and, everything across the board, insurance, restaurants, we don't go out to eat as much as we used to. We've been cutting back on a lot of things. Cars, forget about cars. You can't lease a car for less than $1,000 a month now. And every time I go back to buy a car, I think it's going to be better, but I get the same routine. I'll tell you another anecdotal story. My wife has an Acadia, okay, an Acadia Denali. So it's a nice Acadia, but it's an Acadia, okay. She leased it for 3 years. It was like over $900 a month for an Acadia, okay. That's insane. When the lease was up and we went back and we said, okay, what would it cost to lease a new Acadia? The guy tells us it's over $1,200 now. We were just looking at him like, what? And used cars have gone up 25% in the last year. So we just decided to buy it out of the lease, and because the lease buyout was cheaper than what it was telling me on Kelley Blue Book the car was worth. I mean, but this is insane. And I'm fairly affluent, but like, I can just imagine people that are just barely getting by, middle income people. This is a complete freaking shit show. And meanwhile, you have the Federal Reserve talking about lowering interest rates and a 95% probability that interest rates are going down. So something is really screwed up. And, as it relates to the markets seem to be completely oblivious to all of this as the stock market continues to rally. And the bond market has been rallying. The 10-year is below 4% last I checked, which is good for mortgage rates. But, mortgage rates are still over 6%. So that's not really going to help the housing market. Just to put this in historical context, I'm a guy who's lived through a number of cycles. For those of you who are young and basically fetuses, by the way I look at it, you probably don't even know who Paul Volcker was. But the last time we had a real Fed chairman was back in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. And we came through the 70s and early 80s with massive inflation, right? He was the last Fed chairman that was willing to bite the bullet and crush the back of inflation. And what he basically did was he raised interest rates. The prime at one point was 21%, okay? Mortgages were 18%, okay? He wasn't a people pleaser like Powell. He wasn't someone who was, worried about Elizabeth Warren berating him in Congress over the unemployment rate being 6%. He raised interest rates to the point where it completely crushed the economy, went into a deep recession. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was on this order of magnitude. Unemployment went to 10%. And, it was very, very painful, but that's what it took to crush the inflation. In this case, ever since the financial crisis, 08-09, again, if you're a fetus, you don't remember any of this because you were like a baby. But, ever since the financial crisis, this is like over 15 years now, we haven't had a real inflation because the Fed sort of figured out if they can fine-tune the economy, right, by putting interest rates at zero and printing money, right, because the Fed only controls monetary policy by two main things, which is, number one, manipulating short-term interest rates, and number two, open market activities. And the Fed, for years on end after the financial crisis, kept short-term interest rates too low and manipulated longer-term rates farther out on the curve by printing money and buying bonds. Bernanke did that after the financial crisis, and Janet Yellen did it, and now Powell has done it up until recently. But the Fed balance sheet ballooned to trillions and trillions of dollars. So effectively, the Fed outlawed the economic cycles that we normally had that flushed out all the excess speculation and flushed out all of the inflation that we experience. We don't have that anymore. So naturally, this inflation that was brought to unbelievable heights under the Biden administration with, the reckless Fed policy of keeping interest rates at zero for too long and printing money insanely and increasing the money supply, along with completely reckless fiscal spending, the $7 trillion that was spent under the Biden administration, we've essentially outlawed the economic cycles that we used to have. I was reading an article the other day where the guy was talking about, going back to the 1800s, every 4 to 5 years we'd have a recession. That was like the pattern. Every 4 to 5 years we'd have a recession. All the excesses would be wrung out. The economy would begin to recover and things would eventually go back to normal. But things were much more volatile than they are now. Now it's like every 9 to 10 years. And I would argue it's been 15 years since the last real severe recession, which was the 08-09 financial crisis. We haven't had a real recession since then. We've had modest downturns, but the Fed has been so overly manipulative, if that's a word, manipulative, has been over manipulating financial and economic conditions to the extent that we haven't really had a recession in the last 12 to 15 years. Okay? And I think as a result of just too much money being around, combined with the wealth effect of the stock market and other financially related markets like crypto, have been going up for so long, and throw in the housing market doing nothing but going up for years on end, you have a wealth effect that causes people to continue to spend. And unless you, as the Fed, really put the brakes on and tighten up financial conditions, which nobody wants to see. I mean, the only area that's really suffered in the last few years is commercial real estate, which I'm personally in, so I have a front row seat. Great front row seat. The last 2.5 to 3 years have been horrendous in commercial real estate. But virtually every other area of business, aside from that, has been going great guns. And so when you see these inflation numbers stay persistent like this, it's because it's so ingrained in the Fed's mentality and in the politicians' mentality. And Trump is guilty of this. He's put so much pressure on Powell to lower interest rates. I mean, Jesus, freaking guy's head's going to explode. But, and inevitably, they're going to lower interest rates, guaranteed. They're going to lower interest rates. Now, that's not necessarily going to do anything to the longer end of the curve, because they're just changing the Fed funds rate. But, I've argued for years now on this channel that I think Fed policy, aside from it basically killing my business, which is commercial real estate, I think that in every other respect, I don't think money conditions are tight. They're not tight. This is just a critique of Powell. I've been very critical of Powell. If you look at my past videos, you'll see, I called him Clown Powell, and I called it the Powell Clown Show, and all this kind of stuff. I think his mismanagement of the economy by keeping rates too low for too long, and then him constantly being behind the curve. I think that's been well documented, so I won't talk more about it now. But I think at some point, and I don't think it's going to happen with Trump, because he just wants the economy to continue to do well, and I don't think he's considering a lot of the other aspects to it, like inflation. But at some point, I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe it'll be hoisted upon us by something that'll happen in the market, because I think that leverage is an issue not only at the governmental level, but also in private credit, for example. I think at some point the distortions that have built up over many, many years are going to cause some kind of a forced calamity, which will inevitably, cause some kind of financial crisis, which will cause some kind of an economic crisis, which will then, spiral into, by definition, a situation where inflation gets crushed and finally wrung out of the system. But I'll tell you, it's not going to occur by any intentional means with the current regime or any future regime that I can conceive of, given the political situation currently. All right, well, that's just a thought for the day, so to speak, going into the weekend here. I would say short term, I'm still relatively bullish in the market, although we are going into a seasonal situation where, September, October timeframe, usually something happens in the market that causes a correction. But the way we're going now, with the Fed getting even more accommodative, I don't see anything to suggest that the current market won't continue to go up. I don't know how else to say it. I'm still very bullish on AI related stuff. I will try to do some content that's more targeted toward the AI play and the opportunities I see in AI, because there's a lot going on there. But I just wanted to throw out this kind of market commentary. Hopefully you found it useful. If you do, subscribe and like, because it helps me out. The likes help me out with the channel, get the information to more people. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.